At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. Hello, listeners. Today's episode covers a serious topic and an important one. We are going to be talking about fawning, which is a survival response, and we are specifically going to be talking about fawning during sex, which often happens during sexual assault, but not limited to sexual assault. I'm really excited about my guest who's here today, Sonia Strange. She has been on a healing journey for healing trauma. She's worked with a somatic practitioner for 4 years, and she has been in training for healing trauma, including the fawning response.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
So there is not much information out there about this particular subject. With this limited information out there on the web, when I was doing my research, I wondered, my gosh, how many therapists are trained in this or aware of this happening, having a fawning response during sexual assault or uncomfortable sexual encounter? But I did find a couple good articles. I found one on Psych Central, and I will link that article in the show notes. So first, let's start by defining the word survival response. Our sympathetic nervous system gets triggered due to physical or emotional threat, and we go into either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And the fawn response is a response to a threat by becoming more appealing to the threat. So I'm going to say that again. A fawn response is a response to a threat by becoming more appealing to the threat. The fawn response was first coined by psychotherapist Pete Walker in his book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And it's important to mention that Pete Walker is a marriage and family therapist. And this is important and pertinent because we develop a fawning response if our trauma happened in a relationship. So if the trauma happened with your caregiver, your parents, for example. So it has so much to do with in relationship. Fawning is also associated with PTSD and codependence. Complex PTSD is when your trauma comes from repeated events. So in a family dynamic, in some type of relational dynamic, repeated trauma. And I'll break down codependence. Codependence is consistently abandoning your own needs to serve others to avoid conflict, which is also a fawning response. It is something we do to survive a situation. So really important concepts to understand when we're trying to break down what a fawning response is. It's this survival response, and it's developed as a result of trauma. Some examples of fawning responses are having it be very difficult to say no, fear of saying what you really feel.
Yeah, I would say that I found those things to be true. Definitely the relational connection. Fawning is a performative type of response. One of the things that happens is when we experience trauma, especially at an early age, we develop these coping mechanisms. Fawning in particular has a tendency to become part of your personality. Mm-hmm. So this thing that you did to keep yourself safe in a moment of potentially abuse or whatever, the traumatic event was, like you said, it tends to be when the household maybe is a chronically disruptive place, chronically unsafe. Your skill set becomes appeasing, making yourself small and going with the flow so that whoever in the household is becoming upset or violent, you're making yourself small and less of a threat to this other person. And it becomes your personality. Once it becomes part of your personality, once you've laid down this pattern of response for so long, it becomes completely unconscious. You're reacting and responding in this reflexive way. You're not even attuned to the fact that you're people pleasing or going against your own no, saying yes to things you really don't want. For years, that was one of my things that I was really proud of was, I'm really flexible. And as I've started on my healing journey, realizing that yes, I am flexible, and that is a skill set. And I have gone too far into being flexible to the point that I didn't have a clear no or a clear yes on a lot of things, especially in intimate relationship.
Thank you, Sonia. The important thing to understand about our sympathetic nervous system responses to trauma is we don't have a lot of control over it in the moment. And these responses trump everything else in our system, including rational thinking. And this is by design, right? Because the nervous system takes over and makes the decisions essentially to keep us safe. Doesn't want the mind and rational thought to interrupt the process, and then we end up getting hurt. Another thing to consider is we don't get to decide which survival response we get triggered into, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. We don't get to decide, oh, I'm going to go into flight mode now. Like that's not how it works. It's just our nervous system makes that decision for us. So we don't get to decide, and we can't stop it, even if it happens during sexual assault. So I'm going to say that again. We don't get to decide which survival response we have, and we don't get to stop it. Your nervous system might go into fawning, which is appeasing your abuser. There's not a lot in the moment that we can do about it, but we are going to talk about some ways to heal through this and make some changes. Fawning is a common survival response during sexual assault, which means the victim survives by appeasing the abuser. And if you don't know how the nervous system works, then you might devalue yourself after the fact and have shame about not trying to stop the assault. As many of the listeners know, I'm a coach. Many of my clients, they have been through sexual assault. And one of the hardest things about going through that experience is the shame that we have after. And it's very confusing if we've gone into this fawning survival response and didn't try to stop what was happening. And we feel such shame about that. But we really need to get educated about how the nervous system works, and that your body did this to allow you to survive. And in a lot of really intense, severe circumstances, it does allow you to survive. I even read somewhere that the fawning survival response during sexual assault can create a sense of sexual arousal. And all this is extremely confusing after the fact. Your nervous system is trying to protect you.
When we recognize how profoundly wise our bodies are, our nervous systems are, that they can instantly assess a moment of threat or a perceived moment of threat. And that's what happens, right? When after the traumatic event, you get triggered back into these experiences, even when the threat isn't there. In those moments, when the threat was there, your body makes this split second decision about what's the best option for keeping you safe. The other thing that's interesting, freeze and fawning go a lot together. Your words might not be available in the freeze reaction, but your body response in the fawn will be to go along with what's happening, to reflexively nod, to reflexively participate in whatever way that this other person is asking you to, or that you assess that would make them happy.
I read during my research on this topic that there is a freeze response right before the fawn response.
That is important to start to distinguish those two different pieces. As we start to look through the somatic lens of what's actually happening in the nervous system that creates the response, starting to slow everything down so you can really attune to what's happening in the body, that's where you start to separate those two responses and start to heal each one individually so that it's not overcoupled with these other experiences.
I love that, to be able to break it down into its parts and address each one. I mean, that's what I do in coaching, and it works so well. The first thing that happens is we have heightened arousal, which basically means we're super alert, right? So when we're in a threatening situation, we go into this alert state. And then it's after that we have this temporary freeze. And then it said that we have this habitual response, that we repeat what we normally say when we are not interested in sex. So this is specific to sexual encounters. that after we're in this temporary freeze, then we go into this, automatic response, what you might say if you are trying to explain to someone that you're not interested in sex. And then we go into the fawning, if that's what our body decides for us to do. So some examples of fawning response are speaking calmly to a growling dog. So if a dog comes up to you that looks like they're going to attack you, I mean, we all do this, right? We calm down, we speak calmly, we calm our bodies, we don't make any quick moves. If someone is held at gunpoint, doing whatever the gunman asked to do, that's a fawning response. Befriending your kidnapper. We've all heard about that, about this phenomenon that happens when you're kidnapped, that you want to become closer to your kidnapper, which is an example of a fawning response. During sexual assault, pretending that we enjoy the sex and going along with it can literally save your life, is an example of a fawning response that can be life-saving. And in a violent family dynamic, having a fawning response, a people-pleasing response, because it settles the nervous system of the aggressor, and it can save you from being abused.
The fawning response is so culturally norm in our culture. Being well-behaved, being compliant is something that we get messaging from very early on through lots of different sources. It can be as simple as I get an invitation from a friend to have them over, and I'm not really at capacity for that. Maybe I'm tired and don't want to participate. But instead of saying, I don't want to have you over, or I don't want to go out and do this thing, instead, I'll just reflexively say, oh, well, sure. What do you want to do? Then I wind up tiptoeing into a situation that I really don't feel 100% yes into going into. And I've come into it from a place of this pleasing or performative, trying not to upset my friend and then it just winds up being more depleting. So the way that it's fawning is, how does it feel in your body? It's usually after the fact that you can really recognize, this didn't really feel good for me. I really wasn't sure about doing that, or I did that and now I'm exhausted, even though I love this friend. Same thing goes in any kind of engagement. You can be in a very loving, long-term consensual relationship with someone, but if your pattern is to fawn, it's the same scenario. Maybe I'm feeling tired at the end of the day and my partner wants to be intimate. And instead of feeling the clarity of my own no and being able to say, not tonight, I might go ahead and just go along. Fawning is as reflexive as a sneeze. So there's no decision that you're consciously making, like, oh, well, I'm just going to go ahead and say yes to help my partner feel not rejected, or to get, so that they get what they want. It's literally beyond your conscious thinking brain, and your body will just reflexively start moving into, what does my partner want to do? After it's over, it's not been satisfying. And then those feelings of shame come in, or there could even be resentment, especially in long-term relationships where that's become a pattern where you're pushing past your no to please your partner. And really coming back to understanding this reflexive response within us, starting to bring some healing to that, so that you can differentiate your yeses and your nos, and you can stop being in these automatic behaviors that don't serve you, that feel like boundary violations, because you are violating the boundary of your body's no.
Because sometimes we really do want to engage in these things. We really do want to have sex, or we really do want to show up for a friend. So it can be really confusing to kind of figure out, well, which time am I doing something people pleasing, and which time am I really just doing because this is something I really want to do? And it sounds like what you're saying is the somatic part is really important, to tune into your body, and your body will really tell you what it is. Is it something that you truly do want to do, or it's something that's a reflex from your nervous system?
Absolutely. And I think the awareness is the first piece. There is something happening in your body. So if we slow down and really take the time, and it doesn't have to be long, it can be 5 or 10 minutes, that we take the time to notice, where do I feel this in my body? What is happening? There are many somatic tools for accessing those places and bringing awareness and bringing eventually healing through a practice with that. Once we start doing that work, you start to feel the space between your decisions, your reflexive decisions. And that brings in more of your own inner authority, your own truth. And that can be very problematic if you have been in a long-term friendship or intimate partner relationship where your pattern was appeasing and fawning. And then suddenly you start owning that you have different preferences and saying no. That can be jarring for the other person. You've always been so flexible and now you're not. What's going on here?
You haven't said the word mindfulness, but you are exactly talking about mindfulness, this awareness of your body. And you haven't mentioned this, but it's also an awareness of what you're thinking and what emotions are coming up. And you talked about this space between decisions. That's such a good way to explain what happens when you start being more mindful. Things start to slow down. You can start to notice your process. I mean, I do a lot of emotional work with people, and they can start to notice like what emotion came first, and then what emotion did that move into, and then what thinking did that instigate, and then that thinking instigated this other emotion. And they can start to be aware of it in slow motion, so they can start feeling more empowered about their process and what direction they want to go. And it's also some acceptance, but that's a little bit different than what we're talking about here today. How can we use our mindfulness to notice what we're going through?
One of the most helpful pieces that I learned in the beginning was when my therapist said, the house is not on fire. For me, I mean, the house had felt like it was on fire my whole life. I was constantly trying to control the environment to stay where I felt like things could be safe. Over the course of years, I have learned how to become mindful of, oh, here's the thing that's happening right here in front of me. What's really happening? Let me be curious about this before I jump to respond to the email or before I say yes to the event, giving myself permission to take a moment, check in with what's happening. If it doesn't feel good, that I get to say, my well-being is the thing that's the most important in this moment. So I'm going to take some time. Let me check my calendar. What I'm learning now is about coming into the feelings of the body. It's literally saying, where in my body do I feel this right now? That doesn't mean I can't do it, but it puts the power of the decision back into my own sovereign body. One of the things that I do a lot, which I'd never realized until I got into somatic practice, was I clench my toes so often. and it is a reflexive bracing that I am doing in my body. I wasn't even aware that I was doing it. Just becoming aware of that, I get to ask my body, what do you need right now? One of the things that I've learned is it's not necessarily good or bad, but there's, activation, and then there's bringing us down into a more grounded space. So when I notice something like that in my body, I can bring my attention to it. I can put my hand on it and just be with it instead of trying to change it or clear it, making the connection with my body and what's happening, giving that my attention without the expectation of change, but just really being with it, bringing my breath into it. There are a few different practices that I've learned through the work of Louis Mojica. He has a brilliant podcast and company called Holistic Life Navigation. A lot of his work has taught me about finding the safety, tracking the charge. So this thing of clenching my toes, for instance, bringing my awareness there, and then doing what we call pendulating between that charge. And then maybe it's orienting to something in the space that feels safe, noticing what happens when I orient to this place that feels safe, and then pendulating back to the place in my body that's bracing or holding tension. What we're doing is actually rewiring the nervous system to say these two things can exist simultaneously. I can be bracing here, but also be safe in my bigger environment. And then that slowly over time helps those places that are bracing orient to the safety.
One of the first things that I do with my clients who are struggling with their nervous system getting triggered is to become aware on a physical level of their nervous system getting triggered. I mean, this in itself can be really a big game changer. I start with the gut, leading my clients to notice the physical sensations in your gut. I've come to realize that we usually feel our trigger in our gut first. That's like the first layer, any kind of tension in the gut. As the trigger stays with us longer and intensifies. It might move up into our chest, or might affect our body in all different ways, like you had mentioned, toes gripping, which is something that I've noticed that I do also sometimes. What you said also about looking at your environment for something stable, that's also something that I do with my clients. I call it feelings of stability. Your nervous system has been conditioned to react in a certain way in certain situations over time. And we can actually retrain our nervous system. And the way I see it happening with my clients is they notice, yes, I'm triggered. And the earlier you can notice it, the better. So that's why it's really great to check in with your gut and really get those early signs. And then do some type of soothing exercise, such as the feelings of stability, which is considering 4 things in your life that bring you feelings of stability, whether it's a relationship or a job or something from nature, and you soothe your nervous system. And if you can do that in a dedicated way over a few months, your nervous system will start to get triggered, then know that it's safe and soothe itself without you, which is what we're supposed to do. We get triggered and then we relax. But those of us who have anxiety, we struggle with the part of that process, which is soothing our nervous system. How would you compare before you were doing this work and this was happening to now? I mean, it must be completely different.
I feel like a completely different person. Prior to doing this work, and really because of being in a marriage where there was domestic violence, I have made a deep dive and a devotion to healing. When you talk about fawning, and this is literally something that was an everyday practice of trying to keep the peace in your day-to-day life with someone who is very volatile. I did have a therapist then who said, "You're giving away all your power." I was like, I am doing everything I can to keep us safe. My power is going to try to keep this home stable. What do you mean I'm giving away my power? I'm using every ounce of energy I have to try to hold this situation together. And now I can see how that codependent type of relationship was so outside of me. And it was caretaking in a pathological, unhealthy way. To reference Luis's work, they talk about titration, that when you're healing trauma, it's got to be gentle. This is a place where you have this very activated, overstimulated nervous system that's on high alert. If you do anything too abruptly, it's too much for the nervous system to take in. So it's really been a journey over the last 6 years or so of bringing in different modalities. At first, it was meditation. And then, somatic therapy, and becoming more and more aware and self-responsible, taking responsibility for, my experience, even though they are reactions and they are not within my conscious thought, they're still mine. My body is reacting, and I need to get curious about that because I want to own that my experience in my body is healthy, happy, and feels safe. I am a big advocate of energetic healing, and I've made that not only a personal practice, but my professional practice as well. What that's done for me, like I said, be comfortable in slowing things down, be more intentional about what I am saying yes to and what I'm saying no to, giving myself permission to own my preferences, to say the hard things, even when it makes people uncomfortable. And it's really like kind of become my spiritual practice to show up every day in this authentic place. And that has taken calming the nervous system with healing modalities, with diet, with really being selective and attuning to who I allow in my life, who I spend time with. So there's been a lot of learning about different relationship patterns. Recently, I actually had the experience with someone I had been in partnership with for almost a year, but we were having an encounter where I wasn't really feeling intimate space. I didn't want to say yes to the sexual advances that were being made. And what was so interesting is because I've done so much healing, I was able to go beyond the freeze. So I was actually saying, I don't think this is a good idea. This isn't what I want to do right now. But I noticed that my body was still being compliant. was still responding in ways that were more affirming to what the request was, instead of getting up and walking away and saying, no, this is not what I want to do right now. Was like my words had healed enough to say what I really thought, but my body was still having this fawning response. And to come out of that experience and look at it and say, wow, that's the first time in my whole life, and I'm 48 years old, that I could be the witness to the fawning response. That I could so clearly see, oh, wow, you didn't want to do that. And look what happened. Wasn't that this person forced you. It wasn't an assault, but it definitely was a boundary violation. And that's how it landed in my body. And I was so angry afterwards and so disconnected from this person who I had a loving relationship with. So that awareness has increased so much, this breakthrough into starting to really unpack the fawning response in a very deep way.
Sonia, thank you so much for being so authentic and sharing your story. It helps me, and I'm sure it helps the listeners understand this phenomenon and be inspired by your story to begin a healing process. I mean, there's so many people out there who've been through trauma and they are experiencing the results of that trauma on probably a daily basis, and they feel stuck. They don't know how to get out. And you're somebody who is getting out. You are healing. You are doing the work. You are using your mindfulness to notice, process, and be able to change your experience. So I'm just so thankful for you to share that. And I remember you and I were having some conversations over the last week, about what we would talk about. And I remember saying that, I really want to understand what the other person can do in this situation. Are there signs? Can the person know that you're going through this fawning response and do something about it? And you said, no, they really can't tell. So, we talked about, well, what does the other person do? There's what you're doing. You've shared that. And now talking about what the other person can do. And we talked about how important it is to make sure there's consent before the moment. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
When you're in a relationship with a steady partner, being able to have that vulnerable space where you speak to, this is a trauma response I'm aware that I have. Or if you aren't aware that you have it yet, I have this history in my background that I'm looking at, that I'm tuning into, so that you can start to bring the other person's awareness in with you. And really, you're co-creating intimacy. And so if you can be in that kind of relationship, being able to have those conversations, give them the heads up that, there are some patterns that might be because of my trauma. Sometimes it's hard for me to speak up and say what I want, or it's hard for me to speak up and say, no, I don't want that in the moment. But outside of those moments, it's a lot safer. It's still, for someone who reflexively fawns as part of their personality, even that conversation is going to be hard. Because if you sense that the partner has an agenda or a desire, well, I can talk to you outside of our sexual experience about this thing that I want you to do. It will be really hard for the person who's fawning to say, well, I don't want to do that, even if it's not in the moment. But the more that you can build trust, the more that you can be transparent and authentic about the process, the more clarity you get to have. And as a partner who, I think it is attuning to what's happening in the room, catching the physical symptoms, if there are, places where your partner reflexively pulls back, or if there is ever a sign of, no, I'm not comfortable with this, or I'd rather not pushing the agenda in that moment. It's the same advice for me and my traumatized body is for my partner to say, okay, I'm willing to slow way down and to give this some space and not push past a boundary, even if there's body language that my partner is not quite open to this experience, slowing that way down and waiting until there's a clear yes for that. It's obviously more challenging if you aren't in a relationship where those kinds of conversations are happening. If you're in a sexual relationship where it's more casual, those are going to be very hard for the other person to pick up on the signals. Certainly, consent is paramount, but it really comes down to the person who's experiencing the trauma response to do their own inner work and to come back and tend to the reflexive symptoms that they have of their trauma.
Yeah. And it sounds like that communication is key to be able to share with your partner this process that you're going through, this healing process that you're going through, this mindfulness process that you're going through, and let your partner know so they can support you through this healing process and support you to engage in intimacy in a way that's really beautiful. Because like the story you shared, you ended up getting angry, maybe angry at yourself. So it comes at a cost. It's not like you just go through this and there isn't a consequence. There is a cost. So it is important to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say too, one of the conversations I would encourage is, what are the yeses? How can I help you feel safe? Instead of like, can we push this boundary? Can we, explore this territory? When you're first starting to work with healing your trauma, it would be better for your partner to be curious about how to create safety and where are the places that you can start to open and unfurl, instead of maybe going into the no's. Help build the yeses so that the container can feel more spacious, more safe, have more capacity.
That's great advice. Well, Sonia, thank you so much for being here and talking about your personal experience and all that you've learned and you've shared with us. It's so important. I'm just so grateful to share this with our listeners. I know there's so many people that are going to be touched, and this is going to really make a difference. So I thank you. And I know your healing journey has led to what you do professionally. So I'd love to hear about what your offerings are and how people can get a hold of you.
Thanks, Sarah. I certainly appreciate this opportunity too. This has been a really big awareness in my healing. And so I'm happy to be able to share that. And because of what I've learned and how much I have been able to progress, I did get training in reading the Akashic Records, which is an energetic healing modality that is accessing our higher selves and basically the soul's blueprint. So I do energetic healings through those readings and also through Reiki sessions. But really what I'm doing is coaching. And I'm coaching people through all kinds of different relationship issues, but also things that go on in our day-to-day life, and seeing patterns across all different phases of our lives. And bringing in now the somatic piece is showing me how much more available we can be to our own inner desires, our own inner knowing, by integrating these different parts, these, body, mind, spirit, all together. If anybody's interested in learning more, I have a website. It's soniastrange.com. You can also follow me on Instagram or Facebook. I would love to be of service to anyone who's interested.
Sonia's website, Instagram, and Facebook are linked in the show notes, so you can go ahead and connect with Sonia. Thanks again, Sonia, for being here.
You're so welcome, Sarah. Thank you.
The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD Mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.